You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 28th of October 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program, Donald Trump is in Japan today talking positively about trade relations. We'll speak to the managing editor of Wall Street Journal's Japanese edition. After that,
it tries to be all things to all people, and each country gets a little piece of it, and then they fight to preserve that. That has to stop.
John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, speaks with Andrew Mueller about the 80th anniversary of the organization whose New York headquarters he once said had 10 floors too many. And then from one 80th birthday to another, Brazil's President Lula also celebrating the same milestone yesterday. Fernando Augusto Pacheco, you are Brazilian and you've just been to New York. How lucky is that?
I am very lucky indeed, Chris. We'll chat UN, Brazil, and a few magazine recommendations.
Lots to talk about, Faye. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. Welcome, everyone, to the show. We will start with U.S. President Donald Trump and his big diplomatic swing through Asia. He's reached Tokyo, where he met with the new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, and hailed a golden era of relations between the two countries. Joining us now from Tokyo to tell us more is George Nishiyama, managing editor of the Wall Street Journal's Japanese website, WSJ Japan. George, great to have you on the show on a really big day over there. I mean, just set the scene for us, first of all, if you could. How big a deal is Donald Trump's visit?
Well, it is certainly a big deal. I think there were many signs to show that, but one symbolic gesture was we have some landmarks in Tokyo. There's a TV tower called Tokyo Tower. There's a new TV tower called Tokyo Skytree, and there's also other buildings, and many of them were lit up in the three colors of the U.S. flag, red, white, and blue, to basically welcome Donald Trump.
That really does show the symbolism, doesn't it, of how Japan leans into it. So interesting, George. I mean, Japan has long been known for their prime ministers as well for having good relations with Donald Trump, dating all the way back to his first term. Where does that come from for you? Is it sort of just a culture of courtesy? It's almost like Japan was, doing the things that other countries are now doing with Donald Trump, the sort of ingratiating yourself with him before it was cool.
Right. I think, listeners of this radio, I think many of them are familiar with the Japanese culture. And as you say, I think courtesy is a big part of it. But that said, I think Japan has a very unique relationship with the United States. Obviously, the two countries fought during World War II, but after that, I think they've become one of the strongest sort of alliances to date, and that I think the Japanese know that they need to depend on the U.S. for security, and also not to mention its economy. So I think that is the big reason why the Japanese prime ministers in the past have always almost had a good relationship with the U.S. presidents.
And Takaichi herself leaned into that legacy, also with some of the gifts she brought, spoke about the legacy. I mean, is this something that you feel she can build on, the fact that there is this legacy of relationships going all the way back to Donald Trump's first term?
Right. So, the name hasn't been mentioned, but the name that hasn't been mentioned is Shinzo Abe, the late former prime minister, who really bonded with Donald Trump, from his first term, and I think Abe really went the distance. I believe he gave, right after he was the first leader to meet Donald Trump at Trump Tower when he won the election back then, and I think that really made an impression with Trump. And since then, I believe they saw each other 14 times, and they played golf, I think, 5 times. Goes to show how the relationship they had. And Takaichi made full use of that this time around. Takaichi was actually elected to parliament the same year as Shinzo Abe, and they share the conservative sort of views that they have. And also, she became, she entered the cabinet for the first time under an Abe administration. So she sees him as a mentor, and she, I think the one common thread or the strongest thread that was evident today was the ties to Abe, Shinzo Abe.
And what does that mean practically, George? If you could go into a little bit what actually came out of this meeting. Did Takaichi get what she wanted from Donald Trump?
I think for Japan, the biggest, the objective was to basically make sure that the two leaders got along. Takaichi, the first female Japanese prime minister, she just came into office exactly a week ago. And she is having, her first big diplomatic test is with the U.S. president, and it's Donald Trump. So the biggest concern was that for Japanese officials was that these two people get along. And I think they just did that today. There were so many other signs that you could see where, I think Trump was very happy.
He was very happy. I mean, also that. I mean, do you get this? Are you surprised by that, I guess, is the question. He seems to be in a good mood on this trip, especially in Japan, also addressing Japanese business leaders. He's signaling, at the moment at least, that he wants a positive, good trade relationship with Japan, despite all the talk of tariffs.
I think for Japan, the lucky thing was that, they had sealed this deal. Obviously, there's criticism from, some quarters that Japan gave too much to the U.S. They think some would say the 15% tariff is still high, and others would mention that, this $550 billion investment plan that Japan is supposedly going to, invest in the U.S. But I think they had sealed this deal way before Trump came. So there was really nothing that they were going to sort of, try to hammer out in his meeting. So I think that was the big part. And one thing that Japan was sort of concerned was that Trump would make further demands that Japan increase its defense spending. But Takaichi preempted Trump by saying just over the weekend that Japan would increase its defense spending to 2% of GDP 2 years ahead of schedule. And Trump mentioned that at the very beginning of their summit today, saying that he's aware of this plan. And that was it. That was the end of any talks, as far as we know, about Japan's defense spending.
It is interesting that she was able to preempt that. George, just finally, I mean, if, as we've been talking about, Japan has leaned into this relationship with Donald Trump also because of its history with the U.S., is there another side to that? Is Japan really putting all its eggs in one basket, if you will, or is there behind the scenes also efforts from Japan to hedge its bets, also increase trade with other nations in case things with Trump go south again?
I think he will be surprised. As far as we can see, there isn't such a strong move to basically, put your eggs elsewhere. It's pretty much all in the U.S. at the moment, and I think, given the sort of the tense or the complicated ties it has with China, although China is, in terms of its economic partner, it's the number one importer for Japan. It's difficult, and I think they know that, at least for now, that they need to go all in with the U.S.
George, thank you very much for joining us on a very busy day over there in Tokyo. That was George Nishiyama, managing editor of WSJ Japan. And now here's Monica Lillis with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Conditions are worsening in Jamaica as the world's strongest storm, named Melissa, is now just hours from making an historic landfall. The storm's outer bands are lashing Jamaica with tropical storm force winds. The island nation hasn't taken a direct hit from a hurricane in over a decade, and never from a Category 5. The gunman accused of killing Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has pleaded guilty 3 years after the assassination. Abe, Japan's longest-serving Prime Minister, was gunned down while addressing voters ahead of parliamentary elections. The attack sparked a nationwide outpouring of grief and questions over political security. BTS are in talks for their largest world tour to date. It will be the band's first concert series since its 2021 Permission to Dance on Stage tour. The band will perform 65 dates around the world, including more than 30 alone in North America. BTS's agency, Big Hit Music, have said details are yet to be confirmed. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Monica. The United Nations celebrated its 80th anniversary just a few days ago on October 24th, and among the guests was one of the organization's best-known critics and one of its most controversial insiders. John Bolton was named U.S. ambassador to the UN by President George W. Bush in 2005. More recently, he served, albeit famously briefly, as National Security Advisor to President Donald Trump in his first term. John Bolton took time out from a busy week to speak to the Foreign Desk's Andrew Mueller, but before we get to an excerpt of that interview itself, I'm joined right here in the studio by Monocle's Lily Austin, who helps produce the Foreign Desk and can give us just a little bit of context for this, Lily, because you had been in touch with John Bolton's people a few weeks ago already for an episode about Trump's diplomacy. That didn't quite work out.
Yeah, I mean, it was completely mad because we'd been in touch about this episode about Trump's brand of diplomacy following the ceasefire deal that he brokered with Gaza and Israel, and confirmed the interview for the week. That his team came back to us on the Wednesday and said, yeah, let's do the interview. We have time. We can squeeze you in the afternoon on Friday. A bit late in the day for us because the show goes on Saturday, but we said, great, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. And then on the Thursday, he was indicted. And so actually, Chris, you ran and told me that and said, when is the interview? And then basically right after that, I heard from the team that, so sorry, he won't be available tomorrow. We're cancelling all interviews.
I remember that very specifically, coming down to mention that the news had broken that John Bolton was indicted for allegedly mishandling classified documents. And at the time that you were then going to be doing the interview on that Friday, he was actually surrendering himself ahead of the grand jury's official indictment.
Yeah, so the perfect excuse to not make an interview. We have it on record where he was and why he couldn't make it.
It is a pretty good excuse to not speak to us. And yet, what is impressive about this is the fact that they didn't cancel this altogether. They still said they would be happy to talk, and you got him the following week.
I mean, it was kind of fortunate because it's pretty much unheard of, I think, for a guest from one week to then suit the following week's episode. You know, we don't generally cover the same ground, but it just so happened that the following week was the UN's 80th anniversary this past week. And so we wanted to do an episode to cover that. And a known critic of Trump, but also a very known and experienced critic of the UN and someone who was a US ambassador to the UN. He fit the brief for both episodes. So it was kind of wonderful that we could pitch it again. And amazingly, yeah, his team agreed. He agreed to come on.
He absolutely did fit this episode as well. I remember being way back a sort of intern at the United Nations when he was ambassador to the UN, and he was such a figure on that. What did you make of listening to him? Was it a bit surreal talking about the UN when you knew that there was an indictment going on in the background? Obviously something he couldn't directly talk about, so he focused on the UN for this episode.
Yes, it was very surreal. I think he was kind of on brand, though, with what he's always said. You know, he was very clear about his critiques of the UN and basically how it's lacking and how it falls down in many ways. So it was definitely surreal knowing that this was going on in the background, but it was everything I would have hoped from the interview nonetheless.
Well, let's hear now from some of John Bolton's interview with Andrew Mueller. As mentioned, understandably not about the indictment, but instead, Andrew began by noting Bolton's oft-quoted remark to the effect that you could lose the top 10 floors of the United Nations building in New York and it would not make much of a difference. Andrew asked John Bolton if anything on that had changed.
Well, unfortunately, no. I mean, it's government bureaucracies are kind of inherently inefficient, and a bureaucracy made up of government bureaucracies, which is what the UN Secretariat is, takes all those deficiencies and puts them together. And I think, of course, a lot of responsibility lies with the member governments. They want certain things out of the UN and they try and get them, but they don't want their opponents to get things out of the UN. So there's no final decision on anything. Everything is chewed over again and again and again. And I think that's yet another cause of ineffectiveness.
But is that inevitable given the nature of the organisation as you describe it? I mean, it seems self-evident that with the best will in the world, if you assemble 193 bureaucracies in one place, you're going to get, well, a very big bureaucracy.
Right. Well, it depends on how you decide what the goals are and how you do the work. There are some parts of the UN system in many of the specialized agencies that have precise technical mandates, work they have to do. The International Telecommunications Union, the World Intellectual Property Organization. Those, as long as they stay away from politics, actually fulfill their mandates pretty well. With the big problem at the UN is the major political institutions, the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, which are nearly totally ineffective.
I mean, you wrote last year, and you may have been joking on at least one of these counts. You possibly weren't joking when you said that President Trump should insist that the next Secretary General should be American, but you did suggest that you might be available. In the, I think now especially unlikely event that President Trump would make that appointment, what would you actually do were you Secretary General?
Well, I think the most important thing is to understand that the best chance the UN has to have an effect is to pick its targets and have a limited scope. Part of the problem is the UN itself is a huge, sprawling organization. Some of that has to do with the multiplicity of specialized programs, but a lot of it for the main UN organization and the Secretariat is that it tries to be all things to all people, and each country gets a little piece of it, and then they fight to preserve that. That has to stop. I mean, if the central purpose, not the only purpose, but the central purpose of the UN and the Security Council especially is the preservation of international peace and security, that's what they should focus on, and not all the many, many other things that they've gotten into over the years, like strategic arms control. The nuclear powers are going to do that on their own. The UN isn't going to have a role in it. I don't know why there's even a UN office for that, since it never had any impact. That's just one example. But what I would do would be to radically downsize and focus the Secretariat and the Office of the Secretary General on those core issues of peace and security.
But isn't what you're expressing there, I guess, the irritation of a superpower such as the United States with having to deal with an organization which is, well, almost by definition comprised of less powerful countries?
Well, that's what I think the Security Council was designed for. Originally, it only had 11 members. It's been increased to 15 decades ago, and now the calls are to make it even bigger. And I'll just guarantee you, the bigger you make the Security Council, the less effective it will be.
I mean, does that apply, though, to the UN as a whole, the General Assembly as a whole? Do you think it is important, even symbolically, that all 193 nations should be seen to get a say on things?
Well, that's what people do in the UN, usually at great length, and nobody pays any attention to them. And that's part of the problem, too. A lot of what goes on in New York in the days I was there, before that, and still today, is purely theater. A lot of people are playing to domestic audiences, including the presidents of the United States who speak. And the ability of the organization to accomplish things in the real world has been greatly diminished. And it's kind of a chicken and an egg effect. When the UN is seen as ineffective, people pay less attention to it, and the less able it is to affect change in the real world, even less attention gets paid to it.
I mean, all that said, do you have any, I guess, residual faith in the idea of the United Nations and what a body like that could accomplish? I mean, I know 1990 is a long time ago, and this may have been post-Cold War optimism talking, but you did testify to Congress at around that time that the UN, quote, has emerged as the organization in which countries of the world actually can unite to confront challenges to international peace and stability. Does that no longer hold, do you think?
Well, specifically, that was in the context of having the Security Council vote to authorize the use of force to aid Kuwait to expel the Iraqis under Saddam Hussein. And that was the first time the Security Council had voted to authorize the use of force since Korea in 1950, literally 40 years before. And by the way, that's also the last time that the Security Council voted to authorize force. So it was a moment, I think, with the end of the Cold War, which was happening simultaneously. There was a brief period of optimism about what the council might be able to do that sadly didn't continue for very long.
John Bolton, the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations there, speaking to Monocle's Andrew Mueller. The UN's anniversary is the subject of the current episode of The Foreign Desk. Tune in on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Briefing. And finally, on today's show, I am joined by Monocle's senior correspondent, Fernando Augusto Pacheco, because, Fernando, we have so much to talk about. You've been in New York over the last week. You did just hear that interview with John Bolton. It is the 80th anniversary of the UN, celebrated over the weekend, and you were there. Not directly on the anniversary, but you were there at the headquarters.
I was there, and all I can say that life is beautiful, Chris, because one of my intentions in New York was to visit the UN building. But I have to be honest, all the tours were sold out, and I did left a bit last minute. But thankfully, for the beautiful fortune of the world, I got invited by Gustavo Seneschal. He's the head of the peace and security of the Brazilian delegation, for a very last-minute tour. And it happened, and I was in love with the building. Of course, very close to my heart, and for many Brazilians, because the whole building was co-designed by Oscar Niemeyer, the great Brazilian architect. Brazil is the first country to speak in every single UN General Assembly. So, I had kind of this pride inside of me, and I always wanted to visit the building. Beautiful.
It is a good point. It's also so interesting. Every time, Lula in this case, but it's always the Brazilians that speak first at the annual General Assembly every year. It shows kind of this symbolism of the UN in Brazil.
And every year there's an article, why Brazil is the first country to speak. Nobody knows exactly why. I think it's just convention. I think at the beginning of the UN, I think Brazil was one of the most proactive countries in it. I think it was like, let Brazil do it. I think they do it so well. Why not let them be the first?
Well, speaking of Brazil first and Lula in particular, the current president, he celebrated his own, amazingly, as it happens, 80th birthday. Same 80th anniversary of the UN, 80th birthday of Lula yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. So he was in Malaysia. He was celebrating with all the world leaders. And it's interesting. He's an octogenarian now. And we keep talking here on Monocle, about the old age of leaders. Should they retire? But you know what?
He wants to run for another term, by the way.
And I do look at Lula. He's a very sprightly 80-year-old. So I think there's difference. You can be 80-year-old and look a certain way, and you can be 80 years old and look like Lula. I wouldn't mind looking like that when I'm 80. So I'm not necessarily ageist. I think we should see things case by case scenario as well. And I think he was very happy. Even Lula and Trump, they're kind of friends now, I have to say, Chris.
Well, this is also what's interesting, right? They met in Malaysia. Are they friends? What do you make of this? They had also met in New York, and they shared an embrace, I believe, there. Now they meet again in Malaysia. What do you make of it? They're doing well.
A 50-minute, quite friendly interaction between both of them. Of course, we don't know yet all the details, but apparently, Brazil is on the cusp of a U.S. trade deal, but it's early days, of course, especially with Trump. We have to literally wait and see. But I think something positive will come out of it.
It sounds like maybe Lula has converted Donald Trump a little bit. He was, of course, a huge Bolsonaro fan, which is where all of this started.
And knowing Trump, I think when he looked at Lula, say, "Oh, he looks good for 80." That count points
that
for
could
Trump.
help.
That helps. I'm honestly.
Okay, well, we wanted to move on to something else, Fernando. There's so much to talk about here, but let's look at some magazines, because this was the other thing that you were doing. You were doing lots of things in New York, but this is one of the things you were doing in New York, and it starts with a special social media cameo. Tell us about this.
Well, and it was thanks to that social media cameo that I got my UN tour. But anyway, I was at Casa Magazines, my favorite shop. We've covered that a few times here at Monocle. They literally have such an amazing selection of magazines, and they open a new space called Casa Next Door, where they're selling design books, including plenty of Monocle books as well, good coffee, good croissant as well. And of course, I bought a few magazines. So print is alive and well, I have to say.
print is alive and well. You are, of course, also the host of The Stack, just in case people didn't know that on this show. So we have to throw that in there. What did you bring for us?
I think this one you'll be interested, Chris. It's from the same thing as Racket magazine by the great Caitlin Thompson. I think paddle, that's the name of the issue. It's a new sport. I never played, I have to say, but it's a worldwide sensation. From Spain to Mexico. And you were telling me, Chris, perhaps it's a new thing in the US, but I did see a paddle court in New York.
It is a developing thing. There's this weird difference between the US and Europe, as there so often is, that in the US there is pickleball and in Europe there is paddle. But there is some paddle also in the US, clearly. New York, from the sounds of it, Philadelphia, I remember, is quite big in paddle. So it's there. But anyway, we're not talking about sports here. But the magazine is interesting, a magazine about paddle to lean into the trend.
And they were smart. They saw that this was a very happening sport at the moment. And you know what? After reading this, I think I might be playing paddle because I think it's a bit not easier than tennis. I don't know if I should say this, but there's some elements.
It is a little more accessible than tennis.
I want accessible,
let's go
light-hearted.
with accessible.
Yes. A little bit more squash.
It is somewhere between
vibes.
Squash and tennis. Yeah,
Exactly,
there's something
exactly.
along those lines. What else did you bring? Spin magazine.
Spin is interesting. I always used to buy Spin. Of course, they stopped printing for a few years, but they're back now in print since last year. And this is their 40th anniversary issue. And again, I think it's a very good moment for music magazines. I think 5 years ago was quite a tragic moment. A lot of titles closing down, not printing anymore. This has been reversed, thankfully. And they even have the 40 greatest musicians of the last 40 years. I mean, it's Kurt Cobain, for those who don't know. He's on the cover. Madonna's at number 4. Okay, I wanted number 1, but not quite there. But yeah, very good space.
Critiquing the music magazine choices, are you?
Exactly. But good place to be in New York. And you know what? Not just Casa magazines, Chris. I think I want to recommend people to go to Library 180. It's basically a place for image research. So you can email them before time, and you can just browse around chic vintage magazines from the 70s. And I think Nikki, one of the co-founders of the space, we have a similar taste in magazines, I have to say, because everything was very sexy, glamorous, a lot of cigarettes. And she's like, the 70s and the 80s are my decade. So if you are interested in that, old copies of Interview magazine, do go there. It's very good for research.
Go to Casa Magazines and go to Library 180. Those are your New York tips. But finally, we want to talk about France, Fernando.
Why not? Tonight I'm going to an event here in London. Le Magazine du Monde just published the 3rd issue of their international magazine, which I have to say is fabulous. Of course, if you're a listener of The Stack, my interview with Marie-Pierre Lanelong is going to be in there. I think it's fantastic what they do. I think Le Magazine du Monde is one of my favorite newspaper magazines. Every week they deliver with amazing fashion photography, amazing profiles. We discussed in length, if you're a fan of Vanessa Paradis, because they did a story on Vanessa Paradis, and we discussed how to deal with someone like her. Of course, she's a bit afraid of the paparazzis and this intrusion, but they are at the same time. Le Magazine du Monde is a magazine that prizes journalism as well. It's not a press release type of magazine, if you know what I mean.
Just finally, Fernando, Bazaar in France. This is your last one to mention.
Last one. Great magazine. I think Bazaar has a great presence in France. They're launching their Homme edition, and it's very exciting. It's coming out, I believe, on Friday, so even I haven't seen the copy. But I know Olivier Lalanne, he will be the editor-in-chief of the magazine. It looks so cool. And he's just saying that there's still space for new magazines on your newsstand. And I'm very excited, as always.
Coming up on a future episode of The Stack, perhaps?
Oh, yeah. I sent my request already.
Fernando Augusto Pacheco, Monocle's senior correspondent and host of The Stack. Thank you for joining us. That's all the time we have on this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Monica Lillis. Our researcher was Joanna Moser. And our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.